Welcome to the Streets and People podcast presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. Get Around Cabo Car Free is a volunteer community movement advocating for more transport options for people who can't drive in Caboolture and Morayfield in Queensland. In today's podcast, we'll be covering one of these three broad topics. It might be Road Rules 360, where we discuss Queensland's road rules, the legislation, the design for people walking, biking, in wheelchairs or on a scooter. It might be Not Everyone Drives, where we chat with people whose transport options don't include a car in a car-dependent society. And it might be People and Projects, where our conversations are with people working on a specific aspect of inclusive transportation. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes, and I have somebody who I met at the Asia Pacific Bike Riding Conference in Brisbane called Ishara Sahama. I'm here on Gubbi Gubbi country in Caboolture, just at the north side of Brisbane. Ishara, just tell me where you are and how you ended up being on the panel and what you were speaking about.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. My name is Ishara Sahama. I am coming to you through any channel on which you're listening to for this podcast from Yugara country. I am based on the south side of technically Brisbane, but now I'm living in Logan. So I sort of live in between Logan and Brisbane. For context of how I got involved in that cycling conference, so I work in a startup called Eco Impact Group, which is co-founded by me and my business partner. Her name is Susanna Bransgrove. She and we started this startup around 2 years ago, and Susanna's actually someone she's quite athletic and she's very well connected in the cycling industry and has another business called Bikey Wipes. And so through her Bikey Wipes hat on and my Eco Impact Group hat on, we decided to put in a pitch for the conference for a session on the social impact of cycling infrastructure and what that means. The panel was accepted, and then we put forward a panel of 4 people: myself, Susanna, a academic called John Simmons, and another business founder called Sandy Murdoch. He's founder of Traction, which is a community-based organization that provides workshops for young people, particularly around bike building, and that helps with connecting children to active transport.
I actually was thinking about Traction the other day. Kids who maybe are having a difficult time and they are fixing bikes, and that helps them feel connected into the community. I think of them regularly because one of our projects is actually to increase the number of kids riding bikes to school. What is it about bicycle infrastructure that brought in the social impact of it? What was your role to share on that panel?
The reason why we put the panel together was because this topic was something that was missing from a lot of conversations we're seeing around that conference. My expertise with Eco Impact Group is one that focuses on community engagement and impact measurement. And what that means is, how do you engage with community on a grassroots level or on an individual to collective level? And then how do you make sure that all of those voices are heard, the lived experiences and what each person is expressing is written down and evaluated, assessed, and translated in a way for people who aren't living in those communities, who are making decisions for them, for example, can be seen and heard. And that, in essence, is impact measurement. There's a few more technical aspects of it, but that was the driver of why we put this panel session forward. And it was something that was quite timely, considering that in that conference, a lot of the focus was on infrastructure, like decision-making, sustainability, things relating to where money is allocated for development, active transport planning, but nothing that really covered, okay, what impact does this have on people who are living in areas where active transport or public transport might not be very common, like commonly used, or where such instances of public transport is not very well integrated with the road network. So for me, as someone who is a human geographer, that role is basically understanding how people and non-people systems like the environment or the economy, how they intersect with us as people and our lifestyles, understanding and integrating the stories of what sort of instances and experiences are being excluded from understanding cycling infrastructure, for example. That was sort of the nexus of why we wanted to put the social impact twist on that panel.
That's very interesting, because what I see in the work that I do and my connections is it is quite fragmented. So there's quite a lot of the sort of, you might call the lycra bikers, who have historically been the main voice of cycling. And that's very recreational, quite male dominated, quite aggressive often, and fast. It's about speed and sport. It's not so much about transport. And then you've got the kids riding bikes to school. You might also get those bike parks and BMX parks. There does seem to be a disconnect in how all these different groups can connect. And what about those other groups? For instance, I know a lot of mums who would like to be able to ride bikes to school, and they would love their kids to ride bikes to school, but the infrastructure simply isn't there. Sometimes they live on acreage and the cost of footpaths is really, really high, so that can be really difficult. Are you okay to explain how community engagement works and what it is that community engagement can do in this space?
These are the things that I sort of live and work for, is really understanding lived experiences of people who are experiencing things that might not be in their favour. I've lived on the south side of Brisbane for most of my life. My family used to live in Nunda, which was just north of the river, and that was during the early 2000s, where transport and infrastructure was very different. But moving to the south side, we moved to a suburb which was master planned, so everything was very well thought out, including walking tracks and cars. For me, growing up in a place like that, I became very aware of how you as an individual and your community actually travels and interacts with different lifestyle choices and establishments. In terms of how that translates to community, especially in the context of Brisbane or Australia, we are populations that are either living in areas that are completely car dependent, or we are living very close to one another and therefore have shared amenities. For me personally, growing up in a place where it was a bit of both, you have the community connection and you have areas where, okay, maybe I have to get into the car and drive for 5 minutes just to see someone who's down the road, really painted a picture to me of how difficult it can be to connect with community and therefore how to listen to one another. And that was sort of antithetical to how I grew up in cultures where you share everything, it's very communal, it's very collective. And the reason why I'm sharing these sort of personal stories is because it relates to how I do my work around community engagement. For me to understand and listen to communities, I also have to come in from a place of deep listening, but also drawing parallels between my own personal experiences so that I can build empathy for those who are sharing their experiences of why they can't get access to a certain area, or why they have very limited access to public infrastructure, or why it's very difficult for them to access the public park because there's not enough street lights, for example, and it makes them feel unsafe to walk to the public park, which might be just a kilometre down from their house. So with work, for example, through Echo Impact Group, depending on who we interact with or our clients, for example, the communities might vary. And quite recently, we have been in discussions with a few people around active transport, particularly around walking. So active living through walkability and what that might mean in the inner city for those who are living in suburban areas close to the CBD. And ironically, it is sometimes difficult to walk to the CBD because of the hilly natures of some of the inner city suburbs, but also how car dependent the area is and how unsafe it can be for pedestrians. And so understanding community means being someone who can sit and listen with community. These, from a human geographer or qualitative researcher perspective, it is these data points that actually help inform one another, as well as those who might be listening who are decision makers in urban planning or infrastructure development, or even your local representatives, that, okay, these are people who are, I guess, your end users. These are the people who are using our infrastructure. We've developed, from a perspective of developer or even from urban planning, they're using our infrastructure, and the way in which they're using it or the way in which they're impacted by it is having a real-time effect on their lifestyle choices, on the quality of their life. Let's say if you're living in an area that might not be master planned and might have a certain urban structure where you do need to get into the car and drive for every single thing. I now live in a place like that, which is a little bit different from living in a master planned neighborhood. For me, it's a 20-minute drive to get to the nearest shops. So to even think about, okay, I need something really quickly from the shops, I need an extra 30 to 40 minutes just to get that. It's a bit of an inconvenience, which is why now I have to make decisions with family of, okay, if we need to get something from the shops, we need to plan ahead rather than before where I could walk down to the corner store. And that makes a difference in everyone's lives, depending on who you are. So if you're an elderly person and you live in a suburban area where you don't have access to a lot lot of public infrastructure that is for walking, it makes it very difficult for you to get to places which have amenities. And that was the case in this previous suburb I was living in. There were certain areas where they had aged care residencies and they were closed. They had the amenities that they needed, but if residents wanted to walk outside, they'd have to walk 2-3 kilometers to get to the nearest corner store or to the next park, versus young families who are most of the time, and I'm generalizing, happy to get into a car, drive to the park, walk around there, and then come back home. But depending on who you are and what your lived experience is, and also what other considerations you have for yourself, such as your health, who else you're living with, if you have children, if you are caring for parents or someone else in your home, the access that you have to transport and infrastructure that enables active use, so like walking or even going on a bicycle or a scooter or whatever other form of active transport, is severely impacted by its allocation and how it's planned around suburban areas. A lot of residents across Brisbane and Sunshine Coast and Logan and Gold Coast, we live in suburban areas that are typically not very well connected by pathways, even though they could be. Something that is a 3-minute drive could easily be replaced by, okay, well, this is maybe a 15-minute walk, which is much better for our health and much better for getting out into nature and connecting with other people and enjoying time with family and friends. That choice is maybe not deliberately, but it's no longer available as a viable choice when you have infrastructure and planning decisions made which don't center lived experience and community voices. And so in a nutshell, that's how community engagement, I guess, works.
There's a few things that I just want to pull out from that. Where I live, I guess it was built in the early 1980s. The roads are quite wide. Probably just the easiest way would be just to make our streets a little bit safer so people drive at a more safe speed, redesign it just with a couple of minor tweaks that would allow people to walk, so fill in some footpath gaps, things like that. But it is difficult when you get to a major highway. There are areas, we have the Bruce Highway not far away, and it's a wall and you cannot go from one side to the other. And these kinds of infrastructure make a huge difference, as you say, on the lived experience of the people who are there. And people who are in decision-making roles about the design don't sit within that lived experience. So even something as small as when a footpath is at 90 degrees, so you go straight ahead and then you turn right or left, there is no rounded corner to go right or left, so you can push a pram or a wheelchair or a bicycle or a scooter. That sort of small little thing that is inconsequential for somebody sitting in council's head office or in the developer's office, they don't really think about that. They have what's called the windscreen bias. If you're always looking through the windscreen, then you don't actually imagine that it can be any other way. So that's just one thing. I like the approach, well, what is the lived experience of the people? And I hadn't been able to articulate that, so thank you very much. I reach out to lots of people in the community. I talk to lots of people, and sometimes I can get quite a lot of hostility from people. I'm not going to give up my car or my car space or any road speed, or there is a real sense of, I don't know whether it's entitlement, but my sense of when you're in a car, it's like the car frame becomes your identity and you feel very safe inside that space. Outside, anything can happen. But inside, I think it's a bit like if you're locked in your room as a child. When I was growing up, my parents had an old-fashioned way of doing things and they used to lock me in my room. And I could go anywhere in that room, but I couldn't leave that room. And so I wonder if the car creates that idea that I am in the room and I'm moving through the space, but I don't have quite the freedom that I think I have. And so I feel slightly trapped, but free at the same time. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because it reminded me of some of the points that we discussed in that conference we mentioned before. I didn't raise these points, but the academic on the panel, Dr. John Simmons, he did an overview of car dependency and harm and how we don't see these sort of symptoms or issues until you actually live in it. And for those who are very car dependent, which is most of us, and I won't say it's just a few of us, but Australia, let alone Brisbane or Southeast Queensland, is designed in a way where we are car dependent. Some of the issues around car dependency is around sedentary lifestyle. You're constantly sitting and therefore you're not as active active. There's isolation. So if you're driving alone, or even if you're in the company of a few others, you're still disconnected from community most of the time. And if you're driving for long periods of time every week or every month, that amount of time is also taken away from the possibility of you being within community and within larger social groups. There's a few other issues or externalities. There's consumption of space, time, and resources, which can, take up your decision making for where you allocate your time and energy. If that has to go into where you travel and how you travel, how much time it will take because of the car and how roads are designed and how long a trip could actually take. That is also taking you away from other activities such as things related to fitness, to socialization, to spending time with family even. I think a lot of what happens with car dependency is also an increase of aggression, and this was also another factor in that study, is that we have more of a tendency to be more aggressive because of the way in which, even if you're not an aggressive driver, you are in an environment where you are viewing other drivers who might be showing aggression or showing behaviors which might be more selfish in terms of how they drive and how unsafe it can be on the road. And that leads to this sort of negativity in your life. I know as someone who does drive a lot, considering how far I live from the city, and I do work in the city most of the time, I do pick up on those emotions and those behaviors when on the road, and it can be really draining at times and can have an impact on even your mood when you come into work, or if you've witnessed a car crash on the road or something, a close call. These little behaviors and these little instances have an impact on your social well-being and even your mental state. And these are things that people might not think about then and there because they're not experiencing it, or they might not be thinking about it. But over time, I think in comparison to when I take public transport, so for example, for me, it's either a half and half of driving into the city or into the inner city, or park and ride and taking the train. And I found taking the train is actually so much more relaxing. It is such a good use of my time because I can sit and read a book or maybe write a few emails. Whereas in the car, you can't do that because you're driving, and that would be very dangerous and illegal. That same time, I've now put into something where I can be a bit more either productive or a bit more mindful, take that as a rest time as well in between traveling from A to B to get to work or to get to a meeting or to see some friends. And that, I think, is an aspect of accessibility that I wish a lot of other people had. But if you're living in spaces or regions or neighborhoods where you don't have access to a train line, you don't have access to consistent public transport such as buses, that is not a choice that you have any longer.
I'll just go back to your community engagement work. I meant to inquire more into that. So tell me how I can engage with the community, because I do, on the one hand, meet hostility, or I meet people who are feeling overwhelmed by life, or maybe they lack confidence in their skills about what they could do and they could offer. Because I'm always opening volunteer help, and I'll support anybody in any way that they want. So if they want to develop confidence or skills in any way, but it's quite hard to get people to think, well, actually they could contribute in some way. And sometimes I put things up on with the community Facebook groups, and people go, but why should I do that? They should do that. And there is an idea that it is somebody else's responsibility to take care of everything. How can I, as somebody who started a community group, encourage people to take action, come and join my group? What ideas do you have?
For context for your listeners and to yourself as well, because I did not mention this before, as someone who's a human geographer, I've built up that experience alongside as a community organizer. So bringing community together and organizing events and I guess instances of collectivism is something I'm very passionate about. In the instances of building community and momentum around that, I'm not sure what it's like in Caboolture, but at least for instance, there's a project that I'm about to embark on where we're engaging with a local community group. And this is just a group of people, volunteers in the local neighborhood who are really concerned about walkability in the neighborhood and how to improve their pavements and access to bus stop and the like. And they're just a group of volunteers, but what they've done intentionally is they've chosen spaces to meet as well in person. I think something that is really crucial in community building is different forms of engagement. So whether it's online, whether it's through newsletters or podcasts, but also every now and then having a place for everyone to congregate congregate and to meet and to share sort of like a big town hall. What is ailing them? What can they express together? Maybe someone else down the road has the same exact feelings and experiences as them, but they never knew because they were never in a shared space to express that. And that also provides a really good opportunity for people who are making those decisions for these people to sit and listen, or to just sit and also be heard. What are the issues that they might be experiencing within their workplaces and certain bureaucratic structures that might impact the way in which they can actually make decisions for this community, for example. So that's, I guess, a suggestion that might be useful.
We had a formal launch of the podcast and we got the police minister to come along, and that was fantastic. People had such a great time. One person said, wow, you should do this more often. And I think I have to give up a Saturday afternoon or a Sunday afternoon to do that. And I don't want to do that every week. I just don't. Because I have a family life. Sometimes I want not to be doing this. It's not that I don't love what I do. It's not that I don't love trying to make the world a better place, but everybody needs time out. I guess trying to find a way to do that in a way which is often enough, which doesn't feel like it's me just doing everything. And I have people around me. People are wonderful. And one person who's helping me with the week without driving, she does everything. And I just turn up to whatever she says, send this out, do that. So I'm like, this is such a nice thing. I don't have to take full responsibility. I'm not having to hold that space. And that is fantastic. But there are other times when it's like, okay, I've got to get this happening. I've got to get it making. I've got to invite people to this and I've got to get that happening. And it's wonderful. I love it. But I also go, I have a whole lot of other things to do. And sometimes I just get a bit tired and I think I don't want to do it all the time. Yeah. How often do you find that it's enough to do it without it being too much? I mean, if somebody else would, I would love that. But I find everybody's caught up with their own family responsibilities and very exciting things that they're doing in their days. So how often do you think would work for something like that to gain enough engagement, but it not to be a burden for anyone?
Something that I'm very passionate about is grassroots movement, but also how do you make it sustainable? Because it takes a lot out of you. You're on the path to burnout a lot of the time. One of the things that I am very mindful of is how do you build a movement in a way that is sustainable? Also, it lives on beyond your involvement. It is hard, but I think a lot of it does involve letting go. And that means, if someone else can come on board and can actually take on a facilitator role, and that role might be done in rotation with a few others who have been sort of constant members in that community, it also makes it easier for other people who have never been involved before to participate, to come together and talk about the issues that you want to talk about. But it also removes that burden of responsibility from just one person. And if that's just your shoulders, then that gets dissipated with other people. It's so important. And so the community that you've built, I'm sure that there's a few people that you could, no, not at all. So I guess a little bit more, once a little bit more time goes on, I think over time, and this is the same in grassroots and community organizing, the more consistency is there around an event or even a podcast or a gathering, the more that people find connection and trust with it. And therefore, like, okay, if there's a gathering that's also diverse in the sense of I can bring my kids along, I can bring my parents along, I'd love to be involved, etc., it then builds up that momentum within local communities. And something else that is quite pivotal to this is collaborating with different organizations, different local neighborhood orgs or clubs, even those who walk their dogs. They might know of people, if you pass them by the street. What's really interesting is that we're seeing a lot more of these movements around, particularly outer suburb from Brisbane, because people are being impacted by a lack of decision making for equitable active transport use. And therefore they have a lot to say, but they don't have a place or a medium to say it. Over time, people then naturally organize and they come together. But I think as more people are aware of, okay, this is the medium for me to express myself, then they'll congregate. And over time, people will start to be like, I can put my hand up for this. I can help you for this. And sometimes it might even be worth just putting a call out, even if it doesn't feel right at the time because it's never been done before, asking for help or asking for support is better to be done than not, because you never know who's actually been supporting the sidelines and just never had the courage to be like, okay, well, actually, I'd love to, and I've got a spare Saturday, or I'd love to do this on the free time I have.
Yeah, I've tried that, and no one comes forward. In the 1980s, we became customers. We stopped being citizens and we started being customers. We stopped being passengers. We started becoming customers. We stopped being residents. We started becoming customers. And when you're a customer, you actually stop participating, seeing yourself as an active participant in the relationship. You're there, you go in, you purchase, you leave. And I think that mindset has permeated the way that people engage with public spaces and public engagement and community engagement. That is something I see, because I think back to the 1970s, and I mean, it was very different in those days, but I think there was more a sense that there were more people around who were interested. I guess you had the tuck shop ladies and all that. Maybe that still exists, I don't know, but maybe it's been outsourced because it was ended up being cheap, or you had insurance or OH&S, or there was some formality that got in the way of that community, and so people have had to sort of take a step back. So I think there has been these sort of small little ways that have interrupted the natural connection that humans seek to do. So we're coming up to the end of time. One of our listeners is a beautiful woman. She has a couple of little kids at home. She's just texted me. She's a friend of mine, and she said, I want to get a new footpath along on my street. I'm meeting the councillor. How do I get something like that happening? So how would she perhaps engage with the community to get something like that? Or is there anything else that you would like to share so that we engage in the community more? Any other thoughts you may have for people to take action?
I mean, the power of social media is quite strong. Even just putting a poll up there about what you think about this certain pathway or things to do with safety will get the attention of a local councillor, because it affects safety, whether it's physical or otherwise. And particularly considering the demographic, like if there are young kids in the area, how do we make the neighbourhood safer? Footpaths that are unsafe, even if it's uneven, for example, is something that council can obviously take action on. I would say that one, using your social media to get as many residents in your local area, even 2 streets down, involved. Let's say, for example, out here and where I live, there's a little closed Facebook group for all the residents, and the amount of people that you see on there actually posting, okay, there's a big pothole on the road now, or like this footpath there's a lot of flash flooding that happens out here, and also instances of the same where you might have footpaths that are no longer there. The more that you get engagement, even as people commenting, that is actually data for your councillor to consider, and you actually have the evidence there that it's irrefutable, it cannot be denied. That's one. The other is, the more that you engage in conversations one-on-one, the more that people feel empowered themselves to also take up the same issue with their councillors independently. So then you have more cases of people complaining about the same issue until council actually comes and fixes the issue in the next week. So I think those are the two things that I would say would work quite well. The more people are engaged and the more they're aware of the one issue that might be impacting them for their safety and their participation outside, the quicker the response would be from council.
There is an app called Snap Send Solve, which is a reporting app. All councils in Australia and New Zealand use that app, although some have more engagement than others. A pothole or a broken footpath or abandoned trolley, graffiti, rubbish somewhere, broken tree, you can report it through that. That's one method. I just thought I'd tell our listener in case. All right, we'll wrap it up there. Any final last words or comments?
I would say having platforms like this where you can openly talk about, the topics that we just discussed and how community can get involved. To your comment before about people becoming customers is, I guess, a slow reversal of that. Community engagement and the change that happens around that is a very slow process, which is why it can be exhausting and sometimes there's no end in sight. But the longer that something sticks around, the closer it is to actually changing something. At least that's my belief with systems change and community engagement. And so before, we weren't customers, right? We were actually people who were quite engaged and caring about each other. And I do think we have capacity to be like that again, but it will take time and consistency and commitment. The more that people understand the ways in which they can socialize and engage with one another and share ideas and the issues together in a way that is non-discriminatory and not inflammatory, it makes the process towards social cohesion and acceptance a little bit better.
Yeah, definitely. I think what you do is amazing. I am so keen
Thank
to
you.
keep in contact because I am just about to step much more into the community engagement space. So I think it was really good time that we connected now, even though it's several months since the bike
Yeah,
riding conference. So I'm so glad that I went to that conference
wonderful.
and you were on that panel.
Yep,
And yeah, we're going to share our
wonderful.
knowledge. We might think I'm just one person, you're just one person, but through my podcast, we can actually take it one step further and further and further and further. And that's how we get
Mm,
change happening at a systemic
exactly.
level so that
Yeah,
everybody can participate, stop being customers, start being citizens.
wonderful. Thank you, Wendy.
That's been lovely. Thank you so much, Ishara.
Thank you.
Thanks for enjoying Streets and People presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. We publish our podcast regularly at the usual places and on our website where you can find out more about us. getaroundcabocarfree.com.au. That's www.getaround, get around, that's pretty straightforward. Cabo, C-A-B-O, that's short for Caboolture. Car Free, C-A-R-F-R-E-E. There's no hyphen in that. .com.au. Our theme music is The Thief on AM Sound, which is just like our cars on our streets, always stealing the space. So let's stop that thief.